I'm Ilaneet from Harmony Movement. We do diversity and equity training and leadership development programming for youth and adults in schools and in the community across Ontario. And it's my pleasure to be here again for the second time. Thank you so much for having me. Like I started last time, we always like to acknowledge that we are doing our work on Indigenous land. This land has been a site of activity for between 12 to 15,000 years. And so we just want to acknowledge that and give our thanks to that. And thank you as well for participating. So last time we talked about a diversity lens or an equity lens. We looked at that wheel, an identity wheel, and hopefully had a chance to reflect about where you are situated on that wheel. Today we're going to go a little bit further and do an activity. We're going to go out for lunch. We're not quite there yet, but let's imagine that we are. And we're going out for lunch, and how many people here are doing work in the community or oftentimes are with folks out in the community, helping participate, access places, quite a few. I'm a social worker by training. I worked with people as well with various needs and abilities, and as well I've had a lot of experience navigating community spaces. So what I'd like you to do is take a look at this ad or this poster of a restaurant. Imagine that you're with friends or with someone that you'd like to go out for lunch. You're checking out places. I want you to discuss in your table who would want to eat here and who would not want to eat here and why. So let's take about 5 minutes to just have a conversation at your table. Okay? Discuss who would want to eat here and who would not want to eat here and why. Okay, so I'm curious what came up for you, and I'm curious, what were the first things that you noticed? Can anyone share? Did I see a hand? Okay, yes. The bathrooms were downstairs. Was that the first thing you noticed?
No. The price.
Yeah. Sorry? The price. Okay. The price. Which one? The 3-course, the $40 per person special, or the
All of it, the 40.
all of it, and the $50 as well. Yeah. Okay. And say more about the bathrooms downstairs.
Just that they may not be accessible.
May not be accessible. Right.
To all patrons.
Right.
They may have an elevator, but I doubt it.
Thank you.
Can people hear everything? We just realized that we're at the back going.
I can help with microphone as well, and I can repeat what people are saying. Do you mind helping with microphone, or is that?
Yeah, no, it's what we're supposed to be doing.
And I can help.
I was just saying about safety factors with the washroom downstairs. Sometimes when I go to restaurants and it's downstairs, I always feel more alert just in case there's somebody lurking around down there. More so at bars, but still.
Thank you. What else? Okay, table 12.
Especially the title. The title is knife and fork.
Say more about the title. Excellent. Excellent thing to notice.
She wanted to.
Yeah, so it's a title and like it's knife and fork, so obviously I won't go there.
And me too. I grew up in Israel. I don't eat pork. So similarly, thank you.
Yeah, and also just that it's a prefix menu. So I as well don't eat pork, and I'm a vegetarian, so instantly I feel like it's not going to be a place where I'm going to feel welcome. In addition to that, just even culturally speaking, I'm Jewish, and I see something that says Christmas, and immediately I feel like there's a whole range of cultures excluded. So why couldn't it just say December special?
Interesting. Okay, thank you so much. Really great observations. What else? Anything else? Yes.
I'm finding the door very narrow. Some people with disabilities would have a hard time breaking in under the door, and there's no facility like a handicap push stop to open the door.
Mhm. Excellent. How many times do we see a sign or a word that says accessible, but upon deeper look, when you actually examine the surrounding, you notice all these different barriers, right? A lot of the places deemed accessible are actually inaccessible. Excellent observation. Thank you so much. Anything else? Yes?
I just saw that there's a LGBTQ flag there, so that's one of the few good things about it. LGBTQ friendly.
Thank you. Yes, myself as well. That's one of the things that stood out to me, and I often look for in spaces because it's such a signal for me and many others as well. Excellent. Anything else? Anything else that we haven't mentioned? Or another comment or reflection? Yes.
I think it would leave out a whole slew of people that would probably like to afford to actually be in there, and how would they be treated? Should they be able to afford to work there?
So, economically speaking, there's a barrier to people, right? So excellent. We've covered many different layers of the human experience of our identity, right? Again, when you bring up that wheel of diversity, right? It's one way to look at how inclusive or equitable or accessible spaces are. And it's interesting also to notice, first things that come up to us, is it based on our experience, our identity, right? Or are we also thinking about others? So I never have to worry about whether a space is accessible or not. I never have to call a restaurant and wonder where the washrooms are located. I just take it for granted. By doing this work and really working from an ally perspective, that expanded my lens of awareness and my sphere of awareness. And now I'm looking for things that aren't affecting me directly, but I know they are affecting others, right? And so that's what we mean by having an equity lens. Okay? Anyone noticed, so someone mentioned around food and vegetarian. So they did put gluten-free. Did anyone notice that? Okay. Yeah. That's an interesting thing. So we didn't mean to pick on this restaurant necessarily. We actually created it, so we kind of put some things together. But they are based on real life experiences, right? So real things that we see every day. And so just an example of things that we experience on a day-to-day. And how we see, how we experience the world is really through kind of these filters, invisible filters, right? So again, just reflecting on what came up for you first, and when you spend more time looking at the image, what else did you begin noticing, right? So again, these filters are based on our identities, right? Some of the barriers that we personally experience, right? But also how we experience the world, right? Any other thoughts or reflections or questions at this point as well? We have some time. I'm curious, in your work, when you're out there in the community, do you notice barriers based on some of these dimensions that maybe didn't come up in the image exercise, but perhaps now you can think about, yes, I noticed that barrier. It might be invisible to many other people, but in fact, it excludes some people in society. Can you think of an example based on your work, based on some of these dimensions? Yes?
So sometimes, are you talking about the restaurant, right?
It can be any example. It doesn't have to be in the restaurant. but
So
yeah.
sometimes in restaurants, sometimes in other places, I notice that the chairs are fixed. So they're at a fixed height or they're in a fixed place. So it's harder for people maybe that, can't sit on a backless chair, or you can't move and put a wheelchair there. It's sometimes difficult and they end up sitting off to the side instead of actually at a seat.
Could everyone hear that comment, or can you repeat? Okay, excellent. Thank you so much. So accessibility is something that we're, with AODA, I think we're becoming a lot more aware, right? It's now in our vocabulary. We're seeing it everywhere. for sure. So barriers can be visible, but barriers can also be attitudinal, right? How many times, some of us or people we know, you walk into a space and you just feel viscerally that something is off, right? You're not welcomed, or people are maybe making less or no eye contact. Perhaps people are not talking to you in the same way that they're talking to other people. Perhaps their body language is signaling that you're not exactly a welcome VIP guest here, right? That happens to many of us, again, based on some of these identities, right? Because most of our communication is nonverbal, right? Yes?
I think another thing that I don't take for granted is that whole
The microphone is making its way to you, yes.
I was just saying one thing I know that I personally take for granted, and in that example was the whole signs were written in English. So for me, I could read that, I can see what it's about, I can understand what it's saying. But if somebody has English as their second language, or it's not their mother tongue, how are we, accommodating those needs? And even sometimes in restaurants, you're reading things and you're like, I don't even know what this is that I'm reading with all these fancy terminologies. What kind of meat is it? Just let me know, plain and simple, what it is, So I think in that sense as well, that's something we need to be mindful of, is that not everybody, their first language is English.
Absolutely, so many examples that we can look at language, based on language as well. Thank you. That's an excellent example. Anyone else? Yes?
That along with language and every other language as well, I was also thinking about plain language. And in their example, that there was a lot of words on there that might have not have been accessible for people who do know the English language, but they need something in plainer language.
Okay. Yes?
Of course, for us, one barrier to communication would be American Sign Language or the lack thereof. If we were to go in this restaurant, would we be able to communicate with the people? Would they assume that we would lip read? Would we be able to order? So that would be a barrier to communication for us here. Yeah, and I think with other people as well, any deaf consumer or person who wanted to go into this restaurant, they might face the same barrier.
Thank you so much. Thank you. So thinking about our services, right? This is just an example, but thinking about our programs, our buildings, right? Thinking about what is the experience like for people just walking through the door, right? We have another exercise that we like to do, and we ask people to imagine what it's like to walk into their agency or their workplace as if for the first time, right? Because again, we've come accustomed to certain things, certain visual things that are displayed on the walls or around, we start taking for granted. But when someone walks in for the very first time, they might be noticing things that we don't anymore, right? And so the question is, what is the message that our space is sending visually, explicitly, but also implicitly, right? And those are a lot more nuanced. They may be hidden, but it's important to expose them, right? It's really important to kind of consider that feeling, right? Because inclusion is about how people feel when they leave our interactions. It's really what it's about, how they feel, right? It's not a list of check boxes, but really making sure that they feel heard, they feel validated, affirmed, reflected, all of those things, right? So I'm hoping that we can make that connection to what we do and our daily experience in the services. And again, thinking about how can we make that experience more equitable and inclusive for anyone, everyone. So these are the challenge questions that I'd like you to consider as the day progresses. Paying attention to the various ways in which we communicate, and we communicate in many ways, right, as we've mentioned, inclusivity and our commitment to diversity. So looking for visual cues like the positive space is one example. The R board campaign is another example. When folks see that, it communicates something very, very important, that you're making a commitment to eliminating that word, that you're an ally. You're an ally to people with an intellectual disability. And the language that we use, right? A lot of the times we're on kind of this autopilot, right? We use cliche words sometimes, or we don't really think about some of the terms or words. But it's becoming a lot more mindful. And finally, how do people with diverse needs know that the space is accessible? And thinking about accessibility beyond physical accessibility, thinking about sensory needs, auditory needs, communication needs, neurodiversity, right? Again, thinking about that wheel. How do people know that you're inclusive? How do you communicate that? So these are some challenging questions because there are no easy answers. It's an ongoing process. It's about working at it. Right? So as you go through your day and you work with scenarios, I always want you to bring that equity, diversity lens and pose these challenging questions.
Ilaneet, I just want to say, when you talk about accessibility, it's funny, I think it was Melanie and I having this conversation last week around when we have vacancies in our system, sometimes they're called partially accessible. And it's an interesting kind of word because so there might be a ramp getting into the house, but the bedroom's on the second floor and it's stairs. Or the bedroom may be on the main floor, but the bathroom isn't an accessible bathroom. So it's this interesting, it's an interesting term to use. Like I feel like you're either all in or you're not all in, right? Like either you're fully accessible or you're not. So, and Deanna is someone that does the vacancies, right? It's this dilemma of like, how do you label them so that you really, it's accurate what the vacancy brings or what the resource brings. So yeah, it was this interesting conversation we had.
That's a tough one, yeah, for sure. And again, like there's accessibility. It's one thing that I think people get. We get it because also in many ways it's tangible. But what about things like racism embedded in the culture of the environment, right? Do we call that inaccessible to Black and racialized people, right? What about stereotypes and prejudice against Indigenous people? Does that make it inaccessible for members of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities, right? So it's a lot deeper than just these sort of physical accessibility markers, right? And that's what I want us to think about. Things that are invisible, things that are under the surface, right? If you imagine that iceberg, I'm talking about the 90% underneath the water that's not communicated. But it's there because we feel it in our bodies, right? Especially people who experience marginalization on a daily basis, they carry it in their bodies, in their spirit, right? And that's what I'm talking about in terms of dismantling, right? So this is it for me, and I have maybe a few minutes to take questions or comments. Yes?
So I just was going to comment on, like sometimes we overlook other barriers and only focus on the physical ones, because we were taking a group of people to a restaurant, and one of the persons we were taking was very, very anxious, and we couldn't figure out why. So eventually he told us that he was worried about not being able to read the menu and order. So our natural response was, don't worry, we're going to be there, we'll help you. And he said, but I don't want you to order for me. And I don't want you to have to whisper to me what I'm ordering. So it was so easy for us to be like, don't worry, we're there, we'll do for you. And he was so upset and he was embarrassed because he wanted to be able to do it himself. So sometimes I think we forget about the other aspects of accessibility that are not physically related.
That's a really great reflection. Thank you. It's about allowing people, or creating the space where people can be their full selves, right? Yeah. Any other questions or comments or reflections or observations? Take one more. Yes.
I was just thinking that the best way to make places accessible is, well, one of the most important things to make places accessible is education and information, because if you think about restaurants or places that are open to the public, we have to realize that a lot of people do not have a detailed understanding of the diversity of people with disabilities. In our case, I work with people with disabilities or people with mental health issues. And I think that, yeah, information, education would open the door for inclusiveness and understanding and accommodating others.
Thank you, and that's a beautiful segue to the rest of your day, because today is about education and information. So hopefully we can again look at every case through an inclusion lens and consider all of the dimensions of the human diversity. Thank you, enjoy your day.